Okay, and welcome to A Brief History of Everything. I'm Chris, I'm your host, and no Thomas. Thomas is otherwise occupied when we're doing this record. He will be back for the next podcast, and he's also probably going to do one on his own too, as a bit of a get square to me, which I'm perfectly fine with him doing. I decided, therefore, that I'd go out and find a very worthy replacement, and I'm going to be discussing a topic really near and dear to my heart. So without further ado, my guest for today is Anne Gripton from the HTA. How are you going?
Hello.
So the topic that we decided to talk about today is my favourite. We decided to go with Hatshepsut. Now, when I put sort of options out there, why Hatshepsut?
Oh, that's me.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go with the story that I told you about. Is that my husband proposed to me in Jezeru, in front of the offering scene. And so I have adored Hatshepsut for many years now and think she was just such a phenomenal woman that I think she deserves to be recognised in that sense.
Yeah, I think that for me, Hatshepsut has always sort of been my main area of interest, and it started at school, and so often it does with a teacher who's passionate about the subject. And the ancient history teacher that I had at high school had visited many times and gone over with Gay Calendar, actually. done many different expeditions over there with Gay Calendar.
Such an unfortunate name.
I know it is, and the kids always snigger. And
as I do.
And then when you take them to one of Gay's HTA lectures and they sit there and they snigger, and by the end of it they're like, wow.
They're transfixed.
She's amazing. And
she is awesome, yeah.
Incredible. But no, my ancient history teacher at high school went over and did a lot of those and was very passionate about Hatshepsut, and it kind of hooked me. It had always been Egypt focused anyway. And then getting to teach it, obviously, for me is another really exciting thing, because I genuinely adore her because she doesn't follow the mould. And in a society like Egypt where everyone follows the mould, she breaks the mould, but in a way that doesn't damage Egypt.
I'm going to challenge you there, Chris. Because,
feel free, go for it.
Because I'm just thinking about some of the previous leaders of Egypt, and I'm thinking of Nitocris, and I'm thinking of Mentuhotep, and they really challenged what a leader could look like in terms of Nitocris being very assertive. I know she comes in towards the end of Old Kingdom Egypt. But she's, even if what the little we know of her is true, she kicked butt. And then you look at Mentuhotep and the way that artistic styles changed in the Middle Kingdom. The fact that they represented themselves almost in realist form, looking so weary and so tired, that I think it's easy to think, oh, yeah, Egypt was the same for 3,000 years. But there are those subtle differences that really show that there is that individuality coming through in each of the rulers.
I will agree with you there 100%. My counter to that is it's breaking the mould insofar as that establishment of new kingdom and trying to establish new norms. And when the Hyksos have been expelled, we're restoring everything, we're coming back, and we're re-establishing these are the gods and this is the way it works. And we're re-establishing this very publicly with all the temples. And that's where I think it's interesting that you get someone like a Hatshepsut. And what I really admire about her is that, and we'll get into this when we go through the idea of her birth scene and her claiming right to the throne, is that she was trained and raised with this idea of royalty and raised with this idea of you will one day do this. And I will get into the validity of that scene, obviously. But I honestly believe that at one point Thutmose I had sort of tapped her on the shoulder and said, "You're it." And she was raised with this idea that this was her role in life. And then for her to be passed over the first time, and then the second time when everything happens, she's basically doing the job. And for her to just step out and go, "Nope, this is my role. I was born for this role." I admire that greatly in her. And I think it's, I see that as a not a challenging in the way that Akhenaten would later on,
So I have to ask you there. So do you think that in terms of the coronation scenes, that she was chosen by her father, Thutmose, over Thutmose II, or because the veracity of that is unsure?
I'll posit a theory, then we'll do a quick overview of her, and we'll come back to that because we can do this in any order, but I really want to get into this now. My theory on what happens with Thut 1 and Thut 2 and the coronation scene, obviously, do I believe that Amun inhibited the spirit of her father and impregnated her mother? No, I don't. No, I'm not one of these people going, yes, it was definitely Amun. So I'm not going to fall for that old chestnut. But what I will say is there, given that she was, the senior royal child at the time, before obviously then you then have a male child to a concubine, to a lesser wife, and do I believe that there was at some particular point, especially as we know that during his reign, Thutmose II was gravely ill for much of it, is there a chance that perhaps she had been raised in these ways of ruling and sort of been trained up by her father in preparation for either taking on that role in place of Thutmose II or raised for that role in case something happened to Thutmose II? I think definitely. I would argue that was quite likely, and my reasoning for that is, again, we're re-establishing a dynasty in the New Kingdom. Hyksos has been expelled. We're bringing back this line of pharaohs. The royal bloodline is to be strong. You can't risk that by having that first male heir die and have nothing. So I would argue that there is, in terms of the veracity of the way that she proclaims it and those sorts of things, possibly not that way. But do I think that he potentially raised her for that role because of Thutmose's health and those sorts of issues? Yep.
I don't doubt that all royal women would have been brought up in that way. I mean, the fact that we don't have actually titles for queens or princesses, they're always referenced as king's daughter or king's wife, etc., indicates that they were trained for those roles. But I think it's a leap to say that she was prepared for kingship. And I'd like to sort of explore that idea that you're suggesting, that she was prepared for that.
In terms of prepared for that, I'm again, my way of viewing this idea of being prepared for that is that I think she was given, and as we said, there's no specific title for queens and princesses and those sorts of things. It's king's wife, king's daughter. Was she trained as a Thutmose II necessarily? Possibly would have for what royal duties were and in that regard, not to that extent. Do I think she possibly received more of an education than a royal princess would have at that time? I think by and large I would say yes to that. And I think a large part of that comes through during Thutmose II's reign. And I think the other interesting thing to note is her political nous is extremely high. She has, and I think, again, her role as the high priestess of Amun under Thutmose II is pivotal to the whole story, the way it all played out, because she knows, for want of a better term, she knows the selection criteria. She knows what they're looking for. She knows how a pharaoh is to be selected and chosen and those sorts of elements to it. I would argue that she wasn't raised as Thutmose II would have been, but I also have a bit more of a feeling that she was more aware of the way that a king would rule than a lot of the other royal.
But when we look at a lot of the queens of the New Kingdom, like we look at Ahmose, etc., that they are very politically active. What differentiates Hatshepsut from those earlier queens? Basically Ahmose kept the kingdom running while, you've got, oh God, I'm sorry, drawing a blank here in terms of names. Ahmose I and Kamose are off trying to rebel against the Hyksos. And she's keeping things going down in Thebes. And so I'm interested to see how you see Hatshepsut's role or training any differently from those.
I think it ends up being the way that the royal titles and the way that she carries herself once she becomes pharaoh, which you have to do. And obviously that's going to change that character, and we'll come into that a little bit more shortly. But I think with Hatshepsut, the thing that sort of always gets me with the way that she acts as regent, which is quite proper, and the way things are done for Thutmose III, that is what happens. You have a young pharaoh in control in Thutmose III. You act as the regent. That's perfectly valid. But it never seems as though there's a necessary plan to hand over. There's a planning going on there. There's a very strong planning in terms of continuity, and it goes back down to various historians. Will come into their theories in a minute that suggest that for most of Thutmose II's reign, that a lot of the policy was actually being dictated by Hatshepsut. Now, again, evidence for this is where we come back down to this idea of supporting with evidence, which, kids, we push this all the time, always support with evidence. But I always argue with Hatshepsut that there is that level of control, there's that level of sort of maintaining, and everything is maintained in her father's image. Everything is maintained in her father's image. And it's almost like she sees herself as she is a continuation of Thutmose I. And that's how she views her legacy. That's how she views her heritage. And everything that she does in terms of policy and structure, it's not a haphazard, what do we do now? I haven't had time to think about this. She's planned.
But do you think that's partly because Thutmose I was not a royal, and that she's legitimising herself and him through her claim through the Almosid dynasty?
Oh, definitely. I definitely think there's an element of legitimising him and herself through that dynasty. I would argue that that's the role of every pharaoh, to legitimise themselves and their dynasty. And when we come to the final part of this, and we get into the secondary part of this discussion, which is Thutmose III and Hatshepsut's relationship, again, I think legitimacy of legacy and rule has a lot to do with a lot of actions that take place during this era. But going into, we should probably get into the Thutmose family to sort of give people a bit more background on this. Because if we don't go into the Thutmose family, then who?
Yeah.
Who are these people? So, again, her father, Thutmose I, or Thutmosis I, or, again, kids, there's a million pronunciations, never worry about that. And her mother, Amos or Amose. And as you pointed out, not really of royal birth.
Mm.
And this is, again, it's part of the fun of establishing a new dynasty is finding people of royal birth. It's always fun. And I think that the background... I don't know if
fun's the right term here.
I'm using the word fun in a context, because you've got your land back from the Hyksos, shall we say. And it's far more fun to have your land back than not. I'll put it
but in that sense too, they've clawed it back.
Oh, it's been brutal.
Yeah, and I think that it's so easy to kind of just toss that away and say, oh, yeah, well, the Hyksos left and they're beaten out.
They didn't just sail away gently and walk away and go, oh, well, we've kept it warm for you. Here, have it back. It's an absolute...
I have a massive issue with the Hyksos, and I'm going to be honest with you. I don't agree with a lot of historians' views that the Hyksos invasion was passive.
No.
I mean, why... If you're an invader and you want to endear yourself to the local population, why the hell would you adopt Set as your patron god?
I'm 100% on board with you on that one.
Because that just says to me, Set's the god of chaos. He's this crazy guy, we'll take him.
This is the one that we're going to have to establish calm and peaceful rule. Well,
and that's the thing is, I know he most closely connects with Baal in terms of the religion of the Hyksos people, but it's not a good way to rule. And I know that there's all this contradiction about the devastation of the temples, and that's when we get to the Speos or Timidos inscription.
My favourite inscription, my favourite temple.
But the thing is, why would you declare something that isn't true?
No.
Is that the fake news of ancient Egypt?
Hashtag fake news. No, I think I would agree with that. I mean, it'd be like you're talking about, that's the wrong god if you want to talk about, calm and tranquil behaviour. I mean, it would be like that idea that Hatshepsut adopted Parket for Speos and Amytos to talk about a kindly motherly role. That's not the god you choose. You do not choose Parket for that role. You do not choose the ferocious warrior. You don't choose the god of chaos. If you're all about love and happiness and understanding, that's the wrong god to choose.
Ooh.
So I'm with you on that. And one of the things I often find with a lot of the historiography, and I mean, we'll save a little bit of Gardner for later because
do we have to?
I take to Gardner with a big stick. I really enjoy taking to Gardner.
Why give him airtime?
No, we've got to give him airtime so you can take to him with a big stick. That's
pointless. Why not look at historiography that is contributing something positive?
Well, the only reason to bring up Alan Gardner, and the main thing with Gardner is, the only reason I bring up Gardner is to point out the contradiction in the way that people can use and abuse evidence. And, for example, use of the royal terms, the stepmother and the wicked stepmother idea versus the great aunt idea, and those concepts, and the way that Gardner, describes Hatshepsut's rule, which is.
But he's such a victim of his time.
Yes, and that's where the context argument. That's where a context argument, which extension historians in New South Wales for the HSC will understand. The context argument comes back into that with Gardner as well.
So that might be something to think about in terms of the new syllabus, where they have to do a source study. So, they can look at inscriptions, but look at how Gardner, Wilson, Arnold, Roth, etc., Redford have interpreted those inscriptions, because we need to be mindful that we're not just dealing with an audience for this year's HSC, but, HSCs to come.
Exactly. And again, people who are just genuinely interested in history who can look at this and go, well, especially with the way that sources and media get used in the world today, especially, this idea of people sometimes saying, choice of language doesn't matter. And people who, especially people who deal with in the schooling system in New South Wales, deal with the extension syllabus, will definitely point out to you the way you choose your words matters.
But even, I know at present it's about extension history. But I'm just thinking, in terms of the new syllabus, and I apologise to people who aren't part of New South Wales, that there is much more emphasis on differing interpretations. So they need to be conscious of how interpretations of Hatshepsut have changed over time.
Oh yes, very much so. Changing interpretations of, and Hatshepsut's one of the best ones in my mind to do this with, because of the way that people like.
Oh look, any historical female is much more polemic than an historical male.
Oh, very much, totally. And the representations and the way that the role can be downplayed more traditionally and then re-examined, and through that re-examination you go, no, actually this is far more significant than anyone's ever given it credit for. And the reason, I think the other thing that draws me to Hatshepsut is that significance. She's extremely significant for her time, and sort of provides Egypt with its backbone for the next, few pharaohs running through. It's the Hatshepsut reign that sort of props everything up and gives Thutmose III his launching pad, gives all these following pharaohs their launching pad.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, I agree. She lays a solid foundation and creates such a stable society after so many years of uncertainty and building that, Thutmose III et al. Beyond him are able to launch those sort of explorations into other areas and consolidate the Egyptian empire in quotation marks.
It's the wealth of Hatshepsut that Akhenaten blows, basically. That's the way I like to describe it to people. It's the wealth of Hatshepsut that Akhenaten blows on building a city in the desert. Why are we starving? I don't know. Could it be a city in the desert? Anyway, so we got to Thutmose the First. That was well done. So, don't worry. This doesn't follow a theme, and anyone who's listened to any of these podcasts knows we flow all over the place. So Thutmose the First, obviously has his first child is Hatshepsut. He then has, to a minor wife, has Thutmose the Second. So obviously, because society has traditionally sucked, he's next in line. And so she gets passed over. Thutmose the Second is next in line to, as often happened within Egyptian society, to legitimize, especially given the Thutmose the Second was not the son of the queen, marries his sister Hatshepsut to provide half sister to provide the extra layer. When I draw this on the board for the kids, it's great fun. I draw the halves and draw the timelines, and they go all the way through.
Oh, it's just and the thing is,
I've got a lovely family tree diagram.
Oh, yeah,
complete with her mummy, and it's because the hands over the chest. It looks like she's giving the kids the thumbs up.
Well, the thing is that we were watching a Tutankhamun documentary in Year 11, and every second word was incest. And it was done in that manner. And I love showing those documentaries. And my favourite one to show, because it is a brilliant documentary and highly important for the study of Hatshepsut, but at the same token, it was also paid for by Discovery Channel. So is the one with Zoe Hawass and but he's
Finding the Mummy. The Finding of the Mummy, and Kara Cooney. And Kara Cooney, of course, wrote.
And we don't actually have any positive idea that is actually Hatshepsut's mummy.
And the thing was, eventually they did positive ID her, but
even that's debatable.
They did eventually, after the documentary was shot. They then did more DNA testing, but the interesting part about that special is...
Which still isn't actually, certified.
It's not 100% for people, but we'll go with it for the purposes of this discussion. And I'm doing it deliberately because I can just hear it in your voice going, no, it's not 100%.
Yeah.
At the moment. But the interesting part for me is that Kara Cooney, who wrote, The Woman Who Will Be King, and it's a really good look at Hatshepsut. It's a very well-researched documentary, a very well-researched book.
But it doesn't have the whole kind of History Channel.
Well, this is where I'm heading. This is where I'm heading, because her work in that documentary is cut down to, did she have an affair with Senenmut? And that's her whole focus. And I'm sitting there with the kids and stopping the documentary and going, who cares?
But the thing is, it's not an affair if she's a widow.
Well, exactly. But the thing is, was there a relationship? And my response is always, who cares? Really, what does this have to do with what we're dealing with? Where can you find the issue here? Let's focus on the rest of what she's doing. Because
it's interesting, though, because...
There's a lot more important stuff in that documentary, though, and like the work that they do around the obelisk when they're...
But it's kind of like, in a way, and this is such a stretch, the Rasputin, Alexandra, Nicholas thing in the Russian Revolution. The people cared. So if there was a conception that she was having an affair, not an affair, a relationship with Senenmut, then, and that was known or acknowledged, then that could have undermined her rule. But the thing is, as a royal woman, would you really risk your role after everything she's been so careful with? You think about how careful she has been in constructing her royal image. Would she really risk it on like a nice guy?
And my argument about the Senenmut thing is that he's clearly her most trusted advisor.
Yeah.
Where she would have needed.
And most of her advisors ended up being Thutmose III's advisors, so what's the deal?
This is also a guy who was constructing amazing temples that were years ahead of, or centuries ahead of what was happening in that part of the world. And he was constructing things that were just incredible. Why wouldn't you have this guy as a very close confidant within your inner circle? I would have kept him close. And it just seems that it's not this whole such a nice guy, you know, maybe there's more to it than that. It doesn't matter in my mind with that, because as you said, you've put all this work into establishing your rule and establishing your legitimacy. And then you suddenly go, but I like this guy. And for me, that's a remnant of that Gardner-esque worldview.
Oh, very much so. Because you were earlier alluding to her education, her preparation for this role. Like she, you know, it's like imagining that Elizabeth II went off and, you know, had a relationship with, I mean, like she's married, so it would have been technically an affair with, you know, Rock Hudson.
Yeah.
Or who's gay, so probably not a good illusion.
Well, that would have been interesting. I mean, that would have been a story. I'll give you that. It would have been a story.
But the thing is that you know, it's so easy to bring it down to sex. And sex sells.
That's what sells. And again, with documentaries, especially produced by History or National Geographic, it's sex, aliens, or Nazis.
And usually combined.
Yeah, I did actually see Nazi aliens once on History.
Oh, yeah. For sure. I remember that one.
It was a round of applause. It was a round of applause.
That's the thing. Like, if she has been prepared to be a royal woman, regardless of whether that is as Queen's wife, you know, King's wife, King's daughter, or King herself, she is not going to compromise that for, want of a better phrase, a good route, you know?
I think, I don't think that, she's likely to turn around and go, well, I've got everything I wanted, but hey, how you doing? It's not the sort of thing that you tend to hear from any form of ruler, especially at this point in time when you've had to fight so hard to get where you were.
I mean, that's the thing. She is trying to legitimise her rule. She is not going to compromise that. And, like, I know that there are those, like, ostraka and little fragments that have been found with her in compromising positions of settlement, but that is more an indication of, as I said, like, with the Romanovs, you know, there's cartoons with Rasputin and Alexandra. Yeah. You know, there's speculation.
I think, and again, there's probably, especially on behalf of some of those people who would have been working in those tombs and in those temples, it would have been, you know, it's the you know, Gary was here sort of right on the wall while you're building it. Nowadays. It's that equivalent of, let's draw a naughty cartoon with these two, but again, it looks more formal because, you know, it's ancient Egypt and we think that everything is far more formal. So I think there is a large element to that as well, and I think that gets.
I must admit, that's one of the things that really gets me about Hatshepsut and Agrippina. There's all this slut-shaming, and yet we don't see any of this in the male personalities.
No, and to go with Agrippina, for example, Agrippina always gets that rap about she was this brutal, heartless, callous, and if she was a male, she would have been seen as being clever and cunning and rude. And with Agrippina out-politicked the males in Rome and did it beautifully and did everything they did, and because she was a woman was slated for it, and that was rubbish. And with Hatshepsut, I think there is that sort of element in the way that those initial history, again, the Gardner-esque histories were told of her. And just quickly to people who, when I'm talking about the language, it's the key term that I always look for in those histories to work out what sort of history you get. And this has been stressed by a few people. Gay Calendar stressed this a few times as well. It's the use of stepmother and aunt. And that's a really important distinction to be made. Gardner refers to her as stepmother, which has that wicked connotation, that evil, manipulative connotation in the way that Gardner uses it.
But also it's only seeing women through a male paradigm.
Yes.
Why can't Hatshepsut exist within her own context?
Exactly. And again, she's not existing as Hatshepsut this. She's a relation of a male in this sense. And that's the way that she gets depicted in those histories. And things like great aunt or looking at the idea of stepmother, both of those sort of provide that paradigm and view. And I think that with Hatshepsut and that language and the way that she's described, and that also brings us into the inscription side of things.
Mm.
The way that those tomb inscriptions are handled, I think says a lot about Egyptian society at that time too. And it also comes from, there's a couple of different inscriptions in particular that I wanted to raise relating to that. And it comes down to, Edward Neville, I think, does some of the best work on this, where he talks about the statues changing. And she does go to a more masculine statue, as the pharaoh did over time anyway.
Mm.
But a lot of the time on the walls, it opens with the he for the pharaoh. And then halfway through it, they drop the pretense and it's she did this, she did that. Blessed King Hatshepsut, long may he reign. Or Makara, long may he reign. She did this, she did that. And a large portion of that was that the people who could actually read those inscriptions knew she was a woman. You're not hiding it from them.
No, but you've got to remember that the large proportion of Egyptian society was illiterate.
Exactly, and that's the key thing, is that the people who could read knew. They all knew.
And that's the thing, Hatshepsut makes that gradual transition to conform to societal expectations.
Yep.
So that, she's a queen, but she's becoming a king. But, I remember a student so many years ago doing an oral presentation on Hatshepsut and sort of saying she cross-dressed herself into the hearts of the Egyptian people. And I just love that, because
it's a great phrase.
Yeah,
I'm borrowing that.
You'll have to thank Maddie Zulli from I think 2010.
Oh, that's spectacular.
But the idea was, she recognized the power of propaganda.
Yep.
And she realized that the Egyptian people just wanted that stability.
Yeah.
And so she conformed to that expectation. I mean, there are times where she toys. There's a transitional phase where she's sort of part female, part male. It's this quasi-morphic representation. But it's interesting that, when we get to the erasures part of the discussion, what's erased and what isn't. And so I just think that, the idea that she is this female and she's male, she's Hatshepsut, and those pronouns are so important and become part of the erasure program, so that by the time that the 20th century archaeologists are investigating Hatshepsut, they have no idea who she is or who he is.
Exactly. And
they have a name, but they don't know if it's male or female.
Exactly. My argument on that, and again, very similar along the lines of you, is that Hatshepsut fulfills the representative role that is required of the time. So if it is a ceremony which required, there was a statue that was required that was more masculine, or a representation that was more masculine, the representation was more masculine. If it wasn't as important that representation was being maintained or preserved, it wasn't. And I don't think there was necessarily a hard and fast rule for it. I think it was more, this is what the situation needs, this is what I'm going to do. And I would suspect that's got a lot to play into it as well. She understood the political nous of when it was required. And it's like the levels of Gesserit. And the tears going from the earth, as I think it's been described as going from the earthly to the holy. So the lower ground, the middle, and then the upper and the temples. But
again, she's legitimizing her temple there through basically copying Mentuhotep's temple from the Middle Kingdom.
Yep, and including dialogue.
Yeah.
I love whenever it gets pointed out, she was just making all this stuff up. Well, no, she's not. What she's doing is following a formula that has been used previously, Julie Generalizer rules.
She was not the first person to do this.
No, the divine birth and coronation scene, large chunks of that are lifted verbatim. She lifts a huge portion of the divine birth and coronation.
Yeah.
And that again reinforces this idea of what is required for the situation. Situational, this is what I need to do, I'm going to do it. Whatever I need to do, and it comes back down to what you raised before, it's this idea of stability. Whatever I need to do to make Egypt stable and secure it and put us in this really strong position, that's what I'm going to do.
And in a sense, you can connect Hatshepsut with Elizabeth I.
Yep.
She's inherited this complex situation. It's not yet fully established. What is she going to do? Well, she's just going to kind of smooth things out. She's, in terms of Elizabeth I, you've got you've got the Protestants and the Catholics. You've got the Spanish trying to interfere. Well, in terms of Hatshepsut, she's trying to smooth over the Hyksos invasion. She's trying to smooth over, the difficulties that have been present in Egypt and legitimise the Theban rule, because Theban rule hasn't been seen before.
Nope.
It's all come out from Lower Egypt. It's all come out of Memphis and Hierakonpolis. So, she's really trying to make that assertion that we've got it good here. Let's not stuff this up. And so I just think it's really interesting with Hatshepsut in that she is all about creating that stability, and she's been criticised for it. And what the hell's that?
And you've got people like O'Connor who talk about it being the dynastic defence mechanism.
Oh, I love his work.
Which I think David, and then Joyce Tilsley also adds in the idea about it assuming the double crown to protect against uprisings to the throne. And again, a large element of what she does as well, you need to take into account Thutmose III's age, and you need to take into account, again, as we said, this new royal dynasty really, and this Theban rule, and it's all being established. And we're not that far removed from what happened with the Hyksos.
I mean, it's less than 100 years since the Hyksos invasion. Well, since the Hyksos invasion has been, abolished, and yet,
The other act that I want to raise, relating sort of to that, and it's a tangent, but it's not. For me, one of the most important things that Hatshepsut does, and Thutmose III is the benefactor of this incredibly, is the standing army.
Well, that's the thing. And that happens.
Why do you create a standing army? Well,
but that's a gradual progression under the New Kingdom pharaohs. And, we don't get to look at a lot at them, in the current syllabus as to why they're developing. I mean, if you look at Kamose and Amose, for example, they establish a training fort in the Western Desert. Yep. In the Western Desert, and that's really interesting. I find that fascinating because to me that shows that's almost like a secret operation. Which
is then also where Hatshepsut's, where Hatshepsut espoused Hadamidos.
Yeah.
Warrior representations, parquet, and those sorts of things are also in the Western Desert.
Well, because the thing is that generally the Western Desert or the West is the land of the dead. So to establish a training fort and a training camp in those areas just shows how desperate the Egyptians were, and that leads back to the earlier discussion about the nature of the Hyksos invasion. And, considering the archaeological excavations they've done there, it was a serious enterprise. It wasn't just a fly-by-night operation. And then we see the development of the New Kingdom army. We see the professionalisation of the army. And we see that coming through, that the scribes, I can't remember the name of the text, isn't it terrible? But the scribes' text talking about the conditions in the army and so forth. And so I think that's fascinating to show how militarised the New Kingdom Egyptian state has become. And even though people say, and I think we're talking about Wilson and Gardner, Hatshepsut wasn't a militarised queen. She didn't involve herself in campaigns. More recent research indicates that, she was. She was there. She was ordering stuff around.
Well, the evidence that we had, even from those sort of people, the evidence that we had that was solid for her military, and they go, she didn't do anything. I'm like, well, we'll come back to the Voyage to Punt, because the Voyage to Punt is its own little expedition, obviously. But obviously there's Nubia, because she's a new pharaoh, and that's your job, is to go and beat up the poor Nubians.
But yeah, I mean, like Redford states that there is evidence to suggest at least 4 military campaigns.
Well, she talks about, Daryl Bari, she talks about basically, well, we think Palestine. You know, her arrow is among the Northerners. You know, she's talking about where she's talking about the fact that I actually went here. And again, the whole point of the Voyage to Punt and the way it's displayed on the walls of Jeseru is to, again, reinforce, I was here. I actually did this. This is not some, oh, yeah, we went off and did this. I was actually there.
Yeah, that's right.
Look, that's me. I actually went and did this. And it's that again, the legitimizing, which all pharaohs have to do. It's not just a Hatshepsut thing.
And I have to pose the question, because some of those campaigns would have been early on in the rule, because it's almost like the moment you got a new pharaoh in Egypt,
you had to beat up the Nubians.
There was a rebellion in Nubia.
Well, you had to beat up the Nubians instantly. That's the rule. I always point out to the kids that, you know, the warrior pharaoh, the first thing about a warrior pharaoh is that, you know, the warrior pharaoh is chosen by the gods. Therefore, the warrior pharaoh can't lose. So you don't want to fight a first battle that's possibly going to get you killed.
But it's interesting in that we don't have any real visual representations of that. Like, she talks about it.
But the thing is that nobody bothers to write down really their Nubian campaigns, because it's accepted. You're going over the border, the Nubians are going to rebel, you're going to attack some of them, kidnap some of them, and go back to what you were doing.
But I'm intrigued, because we do have some representations of Nubian campaigns. So if that happened early on in Hatshepsut's reign, and she's still representing herself as a female pharaoh, what does that look like?
I would suggest, and this is only something I've considered this a few times actually along those lines. We're talking about representations. I would suggest that it would be very likely that has something to do with the Year 7 co-regency.
Mm-hmm.
Because, again, why do you do that? Well, you need to be able to have the authority to deploy the army, demonstrate there is someone in complete command and control. And it just makes sense that the Nubians got a bit troublesome down south. There was a problem. You know, to quote, you know, the poet laureate of our time, Vanilla Ice, if there was a problem, yo shall solve it. And down we go. And I think it has I actually think that it has a lot to do with Year 7 and the Year 7 coronation. I would hazard that might make some sense.
I would suggest that it's because they didn't know how to represent a female in combat.
Yep.
And so if she were leading this is, if it's in the early years of her reign, when she's still representing herself as female, you know, because we know about that graduation of statuary, etc., where it goes from female to male. And at the beginning, she is still female. Mm. If she is undertaking a Nubian campaign and she's female, how the hell do you place a female in a war relief?
Yeah, I mean, the source we have for the Nubian campaign is all written. It's all written.
Well, that's the thing. So, but when you think about all the other kind of reliefs from other pharaohs, they're visual. Exactly. And so it's interesting that we have this from a written perspective rather than a visual perspective, because they don't know how to represent Hatshepsut as a military leader.
And even her early sphinxes are an interesting sort of hybrid. It takes a while for the style to develop into something that looks like a more traditional sphinx.
Well, because they're figuring out what to do.
Exactly. I would agree with that. The titlery and the look of those statues is the progression is somewhat fascinating, and that's why quite often, you know, there's a HSC question relating to the representations of Hatshepsut and the changing representations of Hatshepsut, because it does relate more to just she looked a bit different. There's actually purpose and reason behind all of it.
Yeah, and that's the issue, is that rather than just describing, oh yeah, here she looks this, here she looks that, it's really delving into the Egyptian psyche as to why they would do that. Why don't they? When we've got so many visual representations of Egyptian pharaohs engaging in warfare, why don't we have that for Hatshepsut? It's because they probably don't know how to represent a female in combat.
Yeah, and she sort of sets about trying to write that a little bit through Jesse. And we should probably come to Jesse because it's magnificent. I'm insanely jealous of, not of the fact you got proposed to at Jesse, but just the being at Jesse is maddening to me because I'm really jealous. Jesse as a structure, having been there, just go, describe, book. Because I'm insanely jealous of you actually having seen it in person.
Oh, you haven't been there?
No.
Oh, okay.
It's the top of the bucket list.
Well, when we went there, some bits were sectioned off, and it was a long time ago. But yeah, like it's hard to actually conceptualize. Just like when you see the pyramids, just like when you see most Egyptian temples, you know, the idea of how do they construct this? You know, how did they design this? You know, I can't even figure out what my bathroom redesign is going to look like, and yet they were able to conceptualize this. And so you can just imagine the planning committee.
Oh, yeah.
It's just it blows my mind.
And again, if Senenmut did have a huge role in this, no wonder she kept him close.
Well, and and the thing is that Senenmut, because considering when you think about the layout of the temples, like Hatshepsut's is foreground, but then you've got Senenmut's on the left. Yeah. And if you've looked at Senenmut's temple, that's where that's where the inspiration would have come from.
Yep.
You know, you can see that clearly. And even the placement of the temple, she's clearly trying to connect to the Middle Kingdom and the glory that was Egypt without going to all the effort of building a pyramid.
No. And again, as I like to refer to the pyramids when I talk to students about pyramids, my instruction I say to them about the pyramids is pyramids are also known as the look treasure in here buildings, which is, you know, one of the reasons why, and we'll come back to the fact that she goes with the idea.
I mean, the thing is, when you look at the step pyramid and what we can find in there, and the turquoise floors and so forth, there's so much wealth in terms of historical knowledge to be drawn from that. Yeah. But I think that Hatshepsut's placement of her temple next to Mentuhotep's is really critical. And the fact that she copies, or Senenmut copies that design and advances on that, is really interesting as well.
And the placement is really fascinating when you look at not just that temple surrounding it, but when you look at its relationship to Karnak and aligning up with Karnak.
Well, but the thing is, you always in Egypt you have that duality always.
Yes.
Always. You know, on the east river you have Giza, Saqqara, Dashur, and on the east you have you have Heliopolis, etc., and then on the left you have Giza, Saqqara, Dashur. And so you always have this balance between the sites. And then at Thebes you have, you know, Thebes and Karnak, and on the left side you have the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. You know, there's such duality in Egyptian geography, and I think a lot of people miss that wherever you have life, you have death.
Yes.
And I think that's really crucial to understanding Egyptian ideology.
And there's a level of prominence, apart from just the fact that it's such a big temple encompassing so much. It's the prominence relating to, again, directly behind Valley of the Kings establishment and again, a Hatshepsut initiative.
But the thing is that you know, the Valley of the Kings was established mostly after her.
Yep.
You know, she was very clever in that she didn't try to connect herself with that. She was connecting herself with previous dynasties and Mentuhotep.
Yeah, and also the prominence and reburial, the idea of the reburial of her father.
Well, yes,
and the honouring of her father, which relates back to the legitimacy of the heritage.
Well, that's the thing, but when you consider that's her mortuary temple, which is separate from her tomb, and her tomb is, you know, variable to say the least. Yeah.
Let's go with variable, shall we? That's the best term for it at this point in time. We'll go with variable as a good description.
But that's the thing. Like, her choice of site is such a statement, but then her choice of architecture is another statement.
There's a lot of Hatshepsut's architecture, both at Hatshepsut and in other places, is very much nobody else can do this. I can do this. No one else can do this. I am providing plentiful. I am providing materials that no one ever believed they could use. The red quartzite of the Red Chapel, the colonnades, the structure, the tiers. It's all, a lot of it relates back to this idea of how prosperous are we? How wonderful are we? Look at what we're doing. We are.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that she's able to build those obelisks in such perfection.
They are, and the idea of the one that broke, and the reaction to that was, oh, well, another one. Just leave it where it is. Another one.
But I find it, you know, in thinking of the terms of her obelisks, you know, Pete Menu would say that they were cooked to perfection. Yeah, like, and
I often get the kids to work out how they believe they were erected as well, which is because there is the other documentary I like using for that one is the Engineering the Impossible.
Fantastic, yeah,
which is brilliant, where they use the sand and use the sand and knock one side of a wall out so the obelisk stands itself up.
Well, why wouldn't you? And it makes such sense, yeah.
And I find that the most plausible theory relating to it as well. You can't just pull the thing into place. You need to be very delicate with it because, you know, you don't want to break them. You've just taken it all the way from Aswan. You really don't want to snap it in half once you get it there. That's a bit embarrassing for all concerned. And in charge of the construction, I dare say it may be your last action in charge of construction and or breathing. So with that in mind, the obelisks, again, outstanding, you know, achievement of craftsmanship in any era, outstanding achievements. The Red Chapel, which I mentioned before, building a chapel out of red quartzite, not done. And it's like, okay, so let's build a whole chapel out of that thing that we can't really cut properly. Let's do it. And again, it's reinforcing this concept of rare material, difficult to use material.
But there again, she connects it to her birth and coronation.
Yep.
So it just reinforces just how awesome she is.
Yep. Lots, and again, this is it's a philosophy that all leaders have used to some extent. I'm wonderful. Look at me. Look at this. Look at what I can do. Aren't I great?
Look at me. Look at me. Look at me.
Yeah, look at me. Look at me. Here's a scene that tells everyone not only am I wonderful, but the gods think I'm wonderful. They chose me. Do you know that my father was taken upon by the god Amun? Who, you know, it's like I always imagine her sitting down and telling the tale. Gather round. We're going to talk about what happened the day my father impregnated my mother.
But there again, like, I mean, you know, that is relating to the Osiris myth, and then it relates to the idea of Christianity, you know, and the angel Gabriel announcing Mary's conception, the divine birth.
Yeah,
divine birth is a consistent story.
It's true
throughout the ancient world.
True. But I like, and this is what I like, is when people go, "Oh, that's ridiculous. Who would have believed that?" And you then go, "This dynasty, this dynasty, this dynasty, this ruler in this country, this ruler in this country. This is not new."
But okay, to draw a very kind of
here we go, the long bow,
controversial bow.
Go,
you know. Islam is a disease which we need to be, you know, inoculated against. You know, who believes that? So people create these statements that, are propaganda, but whoever wants to believe will believe.
Exactly, and for the record, for anyone out there wondering, yes, Ramesses the Great did single-handedly defeat an army on the back of a chariot by himself.
Also,
that's true. That's true. He did.
I totes believe that.
I totes believe he was swinging a sword, firing a bow and arrow, and driving a chariot all at once by himself while his army ran away in terror.
Are you dissing Ramses II?
I'm not dissing Ramses. I'd never dare diss Ramses II. I'd never dare it, just because he gets a lot of positive reputation for living a long time and having many wives and many children.
Well, because
he needed a hobby. There was no television.
How can that many people be wrong?
Exactly. And again, it's not to say that maybe by leaving that many children around you kind of ruined Egypt forever, but we won't get into my argument about it's the downfall of Egypt is children because they can't stop fighting amongst themselves.
Now, if we're talking about a long bow.
I'm drawing a long bow now. I'm drawing a bow so long it would be on the back of Ramesses' chariot. Anyway, we're moving on.
And shooting through 30 copper ingots, I'd say.
All at once, because, he could do that. But with back to, for me, a better pharaoh. Controversial. Back to Hatshepsut. I wanted, we sort of mentioned the obelisk, we've sort of mentioned Jesse. I do want to mention my favourite little, just a side of Jesse, which is the temple off to the side. And
well, she's got two. Which one are you talking about?
Well, what I'm referring to is the development of this god known as the Aten. And her little temple to the Aten off to the side. I love that. I love that when we talk Akhenaten later on, it's like, where did the Aten come from? And you're like, well, it's sort of been around in general fascination, but Hatshepsut may have built a little solar temple to it at the side of her mortuary.
Yeah, we're talking a temple to a solar temple.
Yeah, there is.
I would just I don't know. I'm not comfortable with you calling it about the art and etc. Can you explain further?
Can I explain further? I can explain a little bit further.
I'm not comfortable with that at all. I don't see it as that. So it's a solar altar, but I don't know if
there's a shrine to the Aten.
Yeah.
I don't know. I tend to lean towards, if not the Aten itself, it's a beginnings. It's a beginnings. I would, from a lot of the and again, I think a lot of this comes down to that's something that's being reinvestigated again.
Because it's a cult rather than a religion, and I think that's a big stretch. Ooh, we're getting serious here.
I'm setting you up here. No, I'd probably concede that one to you. This is what happens when you go for the controversial edge.
And just sort of saying that so little has really been found there, that everything you're going to position is going to be mired in controversy.
Of course it will be.
Yeah, and so I'd rather focus on the positives, etc. Yes, there's no doubt that there's a solar element there.
There is a reference on one of the obelisks to the solar cap.
And we do have the altar platform. But how far that goes,
it doesn't go to the level. It's nowhere near the idea of art and worship as a concept.
Yeah, and I think the evidence there is really inconclusive, and I think we need to be careful about making suppositions about that, particularly if our audience is students. We don't want to confuse them with too much complexity.
We'll keep it really simple.
Okay, you keep it simple. So tell me your really, really, really simple ideas.
We'll bring it right back to a really simple idea. So, she's very political. There you go, simple. No. We'll go back to something far less controversial in that regard, which is the voyage to Punt, or Punt, or however you want to say it. I will go with Punt because it's easier for
Punt.
I know it's Punt. I go with Punt.
But it's hilarious because I say, because I know it's Puntites.
Yes.
I know it's Cushites, but I call them cushions and punters. Cushions and punters.
It's like I have a student, if you're listening to this, hello Rhiannon, who remembered Mussolini by calling him ravioli. Still does.
Wow.
It's somewhat terrifying. And whenever she does a new one for ancient history, I just look at her and go, don't do that, please. Because you're going to write it in an exam one day when you panic. Now, that voyage is important for many reasons. And obviously the amount of space it takes up on Jessa Jessero, I think, is reflective of that. It's a military campaign. Obviously, there's the bows and arrows and the firing of bows and arrows, and that's depicted in the battle. It's the visit to the land of the gods, and that, of course, brings back the religion and the gods have favoured me. And she returns as well with the economic prizes that she brings back. So it's the three elements all sort of combined into one, that the voyage gives her legitimacy in three areas: warrior pharaoh, religion, and trade, and basically coming back and showing not just in a trade element, but in, look what the gods have granted me, this bounty, I am favoured, this is how I am favoured. And that's sort of, again, for me, it's one of her most political statements that she makes in her reign, is that voyage. Agree, disagree?
Yeah, no, I agree. It is a definite political statement. I think the materials that she also uses are, indicative of that statement. The fact that she chooses, oh man, it's on the tip of my tongue, but she uses a particular kind of stone. No, can't think of it. But she uses a particular kind of stone which would reinforce that idea that it is politically important.
Yeah, and I think
it's limestone.
Yeah.
But it's yellow limestone, which is really interesting.
And you've got there's the planting of the trees from the voyage out the front of the temple as well.
Yeah.
Demonstrate the bounty that was returned back. And I always love the depiction on the walls and the images of, well, first of all, there's the pile of incense, and which I adore. And the baboons, which students love the baboons. You can't go wrong looking at a baboon. You can't go wrong. I mean, and I think that's what.
This is where I would insert my white monkey exclamation mark. But yeah, okay, go for it.
I know it's a white monkey, but again, I've got students who remember things by calling them Mussolini ravioli. So it's the baboon. But again, it's a very important statement that she makes, and again, it's part of that. We come back to that justification idea. We come back to that concept of this is how I legitimise my rule. Look, I've gone to the land of the gods where we haven't been for a very long time, and look what I bring back. Now I'm favoured, and it all comes back to this idea of being favoured, and it comes back to this idea of being favoured, and that ties back into that idea of that divine birth and coronation scene. And I've been chosen. I was from the god. I was from Amun. It's just a further sort of, and it's a practical example of this sort of metaphysical thing that she talks about with the divine birth and coronation.
So how would you differentiate this from the divine birth and coronation scene and the Red Chapel? I mean, isn't this just more of the same?
It's more of the same, but she can provide tangibles. And I think that has a little bit of weight to it as well, in this idea of you can sort of gauge prosperity off the back of this voyage. The stuff that she brings back, she's able to then trade and use and develop, which allows Egypt to help build up its wealth in this era, and provide that extra level of calmness and stability. The fact that she goes to the fact that she says, I go to the land of the gods, comes back, talks about going to the land of the gods, and everything is fine in Egypt. Again, is that representation idea of the gods clearly do favour us. We are in this era of prosperity now. It is off the back of this voyage. Now, again, it's not, as we know, it's not the voyage that brings prosperity in that regard. It's just a stable period of Egypt. It's a stable period of Egypt. But it's a representation of, look how stable it is. I can do this. I've come back with this. I've got tangible goods. I can show you. Look at these trees. We don't have these trees. I have brought them back for you. This is my representation.
So do you think the connection to, so you mentioned baboons earlier, I mean, they were known as the sons of Ra.
Yeah.
So that, again, is a sense of legitimising her rule.
Yeah, everything to do with that voyage is a more tangible way of demonstrating what so far has been this metaphysical sort of, this is what happened. I promise you this is what happened. You know, I promise you Arten took the place of my father. Armen took the place of my father.
But I mean, there again, I mean, because the thing is, she's not the first person to do this. When you look at the Middle Kingdom, Sesostris was also doing this. You know, he's raising obelisks, he's got baboons. She's linking back to what is known, isn't she?
Exactly. And again, it's don't, you know, it's that argument that you so often put forward with a lot of different things. Don't reinvent the wheel. This has worked. This is what's been done. This is the tried, true and tested way of legitimising. But it is new for this new kingdom era, the way she's doing it. And it's that everything old is new again idea. At the same time, she's bringing things back that, you know, no one, you know, again, we talked about the level of education and literacy in the Egyptian population. This is, there's not really what you'd call historical scholars sitting around at the time in their houses going, I remember this from the Middle Kingdom.
But you would have had family traditions. You would have had, you know, those stories passed down, which we don't engage with because we are a digital society. We don't engage with what Grandpa talked about, you know, because that's not on a screen.
The other thing we need to play into this, and I agree with you, but the other area where I think it becomes a bit murkier is what was the overall impact of the Hyksos reign in terms of those stories and that heritage and tradition being passed, and did that impact that lineage and impact that storytelling and impact the way that they remembered?
I think for the regular Egyptian, and this is my casting a long bow.
Here we go.
You know, I think, you know, they just got on with business as usual. Hyksos rule, Egyptian rule, Theban rule, you know, Heliopolitan rule, whatevs.
I just like the idea of an ancient Egyptian saying whatevs.
Yeah, well, you know, it's like I'm just growing some barley here. I'm growing some rye. I'm growing, you know, I'll make beer. How's that beer working out for you? And like, give me an onion. You know, like they love their onions. You know, we're talking about history from top down.
Yes, it's boring.
And now what we're starting to deal with is, you know, history from below. And wow, sorry, I just lost my microphone. Sorry.
That's handy to have that for a podcast.
Oh, sorry, just lost it again.
No.
Sorry, I'm back. But that's the thing. It's just like when we think about history, yeah, we're talking about Hatshepsut and we're talking about, you know, the Hyksos, and I wonder if the average Egyptian on the street even gave it crap about what was happening.
I would suggest not. My sort of theory is that the pharaoh was someone you sort of dealt with during festivals, which again Hatshepsut made permanent and put them in the calendar, sort of, which again part of that legitimising of rule, but also sort of giving this feel of normalcy to everything. Well,
that's the thing. And when you look at the ostraka from Deir el-Medina, you know, the pharaoh, not so much. It's more about where's my pay. I've got a hangover. You know, it's everyday life, and so I'm just thinking, you know, in terms of Hatshepsut's rule, probably what the people were thinking is like, yeah, this is good. Like,
yeah, we're making money.
I have no idea who the pharaoh is. Is she a man? Is she a woman?
Well, see, my thing then coming back to that in terms of why that prosperity and why that voyage is so critical to her then is consider it a little bit like the stimulus package post-economic, post-depression. It's this stimulus package of we've got all these resources out, let's build. Let's get Egypt moving. Let's climb the ladder of opportunity and get Egypt moving. And it's sort of because she does go on this spree, and there is this spree sort of voyage to Punt sort of seems to come, if you go chronologically in the way everything was built and the way everything is structured, it's earlier, and then everything is done sort of off the back of the wealth that this produces. So it's her stimulus package. It's the moving forward, climbing the ladder of opportunity, and providing stimulus for success for Egypt. And that's, I said, it's a more tangible, and that I think comes back to my point about better being more tangible. Do I think that everyday Egyptians gave a crap about I was born of Amun? No, because I think that everyone sort of claimed to have come from the gods to start with. It's just another claim.
Well, then you have to think about how many Egyptians saw those reliefs,
and that's the other point. Those reliefs have nothing to do with the general population.
It's not like the Daily Mirror or Telegraph, whatever that is.
The Daily Mirror. Wow, referencing.
Sorry, that's again showing my age.
Time for the Telegraph Mirror next. Anyway, I agree with you on that. My thing on that is the next question I was going to raise, and I've got my own feelings, and I think you may possibly go down a similar path. Who is she legitimising her rule to? Who is she legitimising it to? So,
no, I mean the thing is that
because I have my own theories relating.
Well, the thing is, she's the last of the Amosid line.
Yep.
And so what she's doing is consolidating the rule in terms of the elite and basically sending a message to anyone who's going to threaten Thutmose III's power.
Yep.
And then Thutmose III comes along and he has his own son and, like, everything's cruisy, But then when his own son is coming into the position of ascending the throne, that's when he goes, oh, crap, I need to legitimise my line.
Yep. And
and the only way he can do that is by, deconstructing Hatshepsut's legend or legacy. And so he does that through various methods, through the chipping away, through the rectangular reliefs, through the pronouns, etc. And so yeah.
So let's get into that, because legitimacy, legitimacy's been the thread we keep on coming back to, and that is because everything relates to legitimacy. But the legitimacy aspect of it really becomes important when you look at Thutmose III. And we haven't really mentioned him. We've mentioned him, but we haven't really mentioned him. Now, I said one of the things for me is that Hatshepsut's role as within the High Priest of Amun previously under Thutmose II, I think, has a lot to do with the way she legitimises her rule. Because those high priests, if there was a dispute over who the pharaoh was going to be,
she poured money into the Amun priesthood.
Exactly, and it's her influence for the Amun priesthood that I think has a lot to do with the way and who she's legitimising to. She knows the way it works. She knows the way that this is all going to take place. And if she wants to be legitimate, the Amun priesthood need to back that. And she knows they need to back that. And I think that plays in very important into Amun is my father. Amun is my father. She's playing to the Amun priesthood. That's who's reading that. That's who's seeing that. That's who she's legitimising through. The other thing, linking into Thutmose III, though, and we've mentioned him. Now, during this period of time, you would imagine some people are sitting there going, well, what happened to Thutmose III? Because isn't he next in line to the throne? And they rule together. And the first thing to note is that the representations of pronouncements include both of them, and a division of the titles. And quite often they do, it's not even that she's always standing in prominence, they do flip that around from time to time as well.
Yeah.
So there's the crown swap, the upper and lower, the title swap, the positioning of prominence swaps. So it does seem legitimately to be this co-regency in the way it's depicted. Now, the way it's traditionally been put forward, I'll put this through and we'll see what you think of it, is that Hatshepsut basically runs and manages most of what's happening within Egypt, all the development, all the new buildings, all of those elements that she's been very familiar with. And that Thutmose III primarily is put in charge of the army and runs the army and is trained up to be a pharaoh at the same time while he's working with the army.
Yeah.
That's the way that it's always been depicted. And I think that's a fair, from what we have in terms of evidence, that seems to be a fairly accurate depiction. What I think is important to note here is that this argument of when Hatshepsut dies and Thutmose III ascends, he doesn't seem to bear anger against her at any. There's no real evidence I see of anger towards her during the reign. There doesn't seem to be anything. And I've put forward, he's in charge of the army. He's definitely got more of an influence in there at that point.
Well, the question, well, let's reframe it.
Go for it.
He's in charge of the army, but who's put him there? Hatshepsut.
Yep.
So she's not going to put someone she doesn't trust in charge of the army.
You don't put a bitter enemy in charge of the military force. It's not the right move.
So it's not a question of him just being in charge of the army. She's put him there.
Yep. And again, he's got access to the military. And if there was any question of legitimacy that he wanted to resolve in his favour, he does have that ability to try to swing the armed forces in behind him. It would be risky. It would be highly risky, but he would have that option.
But usurpation generally is very risky in Egypt. Very risky. Once you're pharaoh, you can't step down. You have to die.
Yeah.
And so, and the thing is, Hatshepsut becomes pharaoh when Thutmose is at a very vulnerable age, and that speaks to some intrigue in palace, some perhaps conspiracies happening we don't know. So we presume that she only takes that step to secure his power for later on.
Yeah, and that goes back to the earlier quotes in terms of dynastic defence mechanism, which is, again, possibly my favourite quote relating to that. And this, we're going to protect this at all costs. If that means that I have to step up and into that role at this point in time, that's what I'm doing. And I'm going to then do my best to prepare him for the role, and he will be well and truly ready for that role by the time it's his alone. But it's not that I'm going to do it and he's not. No, he's going to act as pharaoh as well. There are two of us, and we are going to.
And that's why she includes him in the reliefs.
Yeah, exactly. If she had completely usurped the power, he wouldn't have been included in reliefs.
That's right.
Now,
and he'd be dead.
Oh, exactly. He wouldn't have survived. I mean, she had, again, at his age in particular, she has that ability. She has that ability to have him removed.
So you have to wonder, as some of those earlier 20th century historians, why they're so vitriolic against a woman in power, and why they see her as a usurper and why they see her as the evil stepmother, when really more recent evidence goes to show that they had a good relationship and she was protecting him probably.
And the removal of her, everyone goes, the removal was brutal, and the removal of all of her images is his attempt to wipe her from history because he hated her. No. I fall on the Redford gay calendar sort of side of the argument, which is political necessity, lineage. It's all about
it really is.
We come back to that legitimacy of rule argument again.
Even beyond Calendar et al., when you look at Anne Macy Roth's arguments, they are just conclusive about how he went about it, and also Dorothea Arnold's arguments that it was a series of phases of erasure, and it wasn't even all the same type of erasure. Like you've got the chipped silhouette, you've got the scratchings, you've got the rectangular roughenings, you've got the smoothings. Like it wasn't even just done, as a wholehearted thing.
And it wasn't like removal of, and it was never there. It's quite obvious it was there.
Really, yeah. I mean, the fact is, if we take the roughenings, for example, they make it very clear that there was something there. They even left the feet behind.
Oh, yeah.
And if you look at the smoothings, again, they often left the feet as tracings. They weren't complete obliterations.
And if you have a look at it's around the obelisk, for example, and the other example is Speos Artemidos, where it's up in a high place or it was out of sight,
they left it.
Her cartouche is still there. Her image is still there.
But the thing is, what they would do with the cartouches is take out little individual symbols here and there and leave references to the gods.
Yes.
So
the Mark Hara, I think they.
That's right. So and even with the scratchings, they would take out the little indicators of feminine pronouns, so that it would appear that she was male.
And the other one that I like to raise with a lot at this point in time is the idea of pharaohs putting their name on other people's temples and other people.
It's not new.
It's not new. And the other thing I point out with Speos Artemidos is that Thutmose III's name is on Speos Artemidos, but also the main inscription at Speos has Seti I all over it. Seti I is all over that. Ramesses II.
Well, I mean, that's the appropriation is classic.
Exactly.
In Egypt.
And again, said the main scene of her at Speos, and I always like to think of Speos as Hatshepsut's statement about herself away from the mainstream sort of depictions. This is almost, I always see that as her statement of this is what I did. It's just her little, this is what I did and this is why I did it.
But the interesting one, I think, out of all of them is the Red Chapel.
Yeah.
Because what we have there is a complete dismantling and reappropriation. That's not just a covering, that's just not just a scratching. And so I think it's that, because the Red Chapel was almost a public building per se, in that people could access the Karnak precinct, that was dangerous.
You also needed to redirect the festivals through your own.
That's right. And so it was too direct a connection between Hatshepsut and the gods, whereas in the other temples they weren't as regularly accessed. And so the obliteration...
And it's very hard to find.
The obliteration didn't need to be as complete.
Yeah.
So the Red Chapel, I think, is interesting in that there were multiple attempts to erase Hatshepsut from there.
And we also haven't, the one thing we haven't really gone into, just a sort of a final point on that, is we haven't really mentioned Neferure.
Well, yeah, but I mean, what's there to say? I mean, like...
Well, this is where the argument comes back about legitimacy of rule. And there are some arguments that maybe she was trying to prepare Neferure for the next in line for the throne. And I dismiss a large portion of that. You very rarely see elements.
But it's like, any royal female would have been prepared for a leadership role.
Exactly. And again, that, as I said, this is why I'm raising that as part of this discussion about why it is important then for Thutmose III to legitimise his own strand.
Well, it's not so much... I don't think
it's not about Neferure taking control.
It's about his son, Amenhotep.
Exactly. It's all about that. And I think that the arguments of what happened to Neferure are far too History Channel and Discovery Channel for my life. And this is why I raise those points, is because just to sort of highlight again the problems with some of the way that mainstream, quote unquote, television histories present this stuff, which is Neferure vanishes. Where does she go? Was she murdered? And it's like, no, really not. We know her tomb is supposed to be up in a cliff face sort of tomb, but the body wasn't there. Well, where was the body? Well, the priests moved the bodies all the time. Things got stolen. The priests moved the bodies all the time. It's not because they hated people. It's because they were getting stolen. So, and
that's actually an interesting point in itself, is that the priests felt it necessary to protect Neferure. Now, why would you do that for a daughter of a hated queen?
Yeah, we don't like this woman. We want them to disappear and never have existed. Let's move the bodies and protect them. That doesn't make sense. and I always come back to, and I think just to sort of bring us towards the close of this, I think too often people can overanalyze and overthink. And I think that people like a Gardner, for example, looked really deep outside of basic common sense. And I think there is a significant common sense to the more mainstream narrative now of Hatshepsut.
But you're looking at post-feminist context, and
exactly
Gardner didn't have access to.
No, he didn't.
And so I think it's easy to sort of say, oh yeah, blah blah blah, Gardner, but when you think about his context, he's seeing Elizabeth II as a ruler, but she's really just a figurehead. The real power for him is behind the scenes. And yet we know now that even though Elizabeth II seems to be a figurehead, she still wields a crap load of power.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem, is that we tend to, simplify things from our own context, just as they did in the past. And so we can see Hatshepsut now in a multiplex of different contexts. Whereas for Gardner, Wilson, etc., no, Hatshepsut was the usurping evil stepmother because women aren't allowed or can even conceive to actually wield power.
It's a male paradigm. It's coming through a male paradigm. And I think that's a really interesting sort of point to leave it on, because I think we've covered sort of a broad brushstroke of Hatshepsut, I think, quite well. I think we've both conveyed the fact that not only is she important, but she's awesome. So, and I'm going with the word awesome. I think it's a really, really good description for her. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Chris.
I hope you've had fun doing it. I've had fun doing this too.
I had to actually stay focused. I'm not usually used to doing that.
Oh, that's okay. I'm not used to that either. So it's all we normally, the last podcast we did, which was American presidents, we kept in order, and that's the most ordered we've ever been. Anyway, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me, Chris. It was great.
We will talk to you all later. Goodbye.